She thought I didn't know. That was her first mistake. My son called on a Tuesday morning in October, which should have been my first warning. Derek never called on weekdays. He was always too busy, too important, too consumed by whatever case he was billing $400 an hour to dissect. But there he was, his name lighting up my phone at 9:14 inches the morning, while I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the neighbor's dog dig up her flower bed. "Dad," he said. And his voice had that particular warmth in it that I had learned, over 67 years of living, meant someone wanted something from me. Monica and I were talking last night. We think it's time we had a real conversation about the penthouse. The penthouse. My chest tightened the way it always did when someone said those two words in that particular tone. My late wife, Carol, had grown up in that building on Michigan Avenue. Her father had bought the top-floor unit in 1971 for what seemed like an obscene amount of money at the time, and what now seemed like the bargain of the century. When he passed, he left it to Carol. When Carol passed, 4 years ago, from a cancer that moved faster than any of us could process, she left it to me. 3,200 square feet above the Chicago skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake, the place where she used to stand with her morning coffee and say, "Walter, look at that. How did we get so lucky?" I still couldn't stay there for more than 2 nights without feeling like the walls were listening for her footsteps. "What kind of conversation?" I asked. "Just come to dinner Saturday," Derek said. "Monica's making that lamb you like." Monica had never once made lamb for me. She knew I didn't eat lamb. I hadn't eaten red meat in 11 years, a fact I had mentioned to her directly at least a dozen times. But I said I would come, and I hung up the phone, and I stood there for a long moment looking at the dog across the street, who had finally found whatever she was looking for and was trotting back toward the house with something in her mouth, tail held high. I already knew, in the way that you know things when you have been paying attention for 67 years, that Saturday dinner was not going to be about lamb. I had retired 3 years ago from a 40-year career as a structural engineer. I built bridges for a living, not metaphorical ones, real bridges, the kind that carry 80,000 cars a day over rivers and ravines. The kind where, if you make a single calculation error, people die. I understood load-bearing structures. I understood the difference between what something looked like from the outside and what was actually holding it together underneath. My son had been a good boy. I want to make that clear, because what came later does not erase what came before. Derek, at 7 years old, bringing me a card he'd made at school that said, "My dad builds bridges so people can get home." Derek at 16, staying up until 2 in the morning to help me sort through the paperwork after Carol's first diagnosis. Derek at 24, graduating from Northwestern Law while I sat in the audience, thinking my chest might simply burst open from pride. But Derek had married Monica 11 years ago, and Monica was a different kind of structure entirely. Beautiful on the outside, engineered to carry weight she hadn't earned. I drove to their house in Lincoln Park on Saturday evening with a bottle of wine I had been saving for no particular reason, and a feeling in my stomach that I recognized from years ago, from the early days of my career, when I would walk onto a job site and something would feel wrong before I could identify what it was. Just a shift in the air, a vibration in the ground that wasn't right. The lamb was, in fact, not lamb. It was chicken, which Monica served with a smile so wide it looked painful. "You remembered," I said. "Of course," she said, touching my arm. "Your family." Derek poured the wine I had brought and launched into 40 minutes of conversation about his firm, about a case he couldn't discuss but was clearly very important, about the school their daughter Sophie was applying to in the spring. I ate the chicken. I watched Monica refill my glass twice without being asked. I waited. It came over coffee, the way these things always do. "Dad," Derek said, setting down his cup, "Monica and I have been talking seriously about the penthouse." "You mentioned that on the phone," I said. "We think it makes more financial sense for us to take over management of the property." He had clearly rehearsed this. The phrasing was too clean, too measured. The language of a brief rather than a conversation. "You're in Evanston. You don't use it regularly. And frankly, the building fees alone are." "I use it," I said. "Dad." Monica leaned forward, and her voice dropped into a register I can only describe as synthetic sympathy. The kind that gets manufactured somewhere behind the eyes, rather than coming from anything real. We worry about you managing all of this alone, Carol would have wanted. Don't, I said quietly. She stopped. Derek cleared his throat. We'd like to have it transferred into our names. As a primary residence. It's more practical, Dad. Tax-wise, management-wise. You'd still be welcome there. Whenever you want. Welcome there. In a property that had been in Carol's family for over 50 years. Welcome there. Like a guest. Like someone who needed to be accommodated. I'll think about it, I said. I drove home to Evanston that night on a road I had driven 1,000 times, and I thought about the way Derek had said management of the property instead of the penthouse, the way a lawyer distances himself from the emotional reality of what he's asking for. I thought about Monica touching my arm. I thought about the wine, poured twice without asking, and then I called my attorney, a woman named Helen Park, who had handled Carol's estate and who was one of the sharpest people I had ever met in my life. Helen, I said, I need you to pull the Meridian Trust documents for me. All of them. And I need to know who has access to the property records at the county assessor's office. She was quiet for a moment. Walter, is everything all right? Not yet, I said. But it will be. Here is what I had done, and what neither Derek nor Monica knew. 6 months after Carol died, when the grief was still so thick I could barely move through it, I had sat down with Helen in her office on Wacker Drive and made a decision that Carol and I had discussed years before but never quite gotten around to completing. I transferred the penthouse into an irrevocable trust, the Meridian Family Trust, with Hartwell Property Holdings, named as the institutional trustee. My name remained as the primary beneficiary, meaning I could live there, use it, derive income from it, but I could not sell it unilaterally. And more importantly, no one else could transfer it, encumber it, or alter its ownership status without the explicit written consent of Hartwell, a process that required identity verification, legal review, and a 30-day notification period sent to 3 separate parties. I had done this for one simple reason. Carol's family had built something across 2 generations, and I was not going to be the generation where it was lost. I had never told Derek. 3 weeks after the dinner in Lincoln Park, I was sitting in my study reading when my phone rang. It was the building manager at the Michigan Avenue property, a meticulous man named Carl who had worked there for 22 years and who sent me monthly reports formatted in a way that suggested he had once had military training. Mr. Kowalski, Carl said. I'm calling because I had a somewhat unusual visit today. Your son and a woman, I assume his wife, came by with a gentleman in a suit carrying a briefcase. They told me the property had been transferred and that I should prepare to hand over the building access records and the maintenance files. I set down my book. They showed me a document, Carl continued. It had your signature on it. Carl, I said, do not give them anything. I am calling you back within the hour. I called Helen. She pulled the county assessor's records while I was on the phone. There it was, filed 9 days earlier. A quitclaim deed, purporting to transfer the penthouse from Walter A. Kowalski to Derek M. Kowalski and Monica L. Kowalski. Joint tenants. My signature, notarized by a notary I had never met, dated 3 weeks prior on a date when I had been in Milwaukee, attending a conference for retired engineers. It's forged, Helen said. I know, I said. Walter, do you understand what they've done? They've committed forgery and fraud, I said. And they've done it against a property held in an irrevocable trust, which means they've also committed fraud against Hartwell Property Holdings. There was a pause on the line. Helen, who had been practicing law for 30 years and was not easily impressed, said, they had no idea about the trust. No, I said. They did not. Here's what I did not do. I did not call Derek. I did not drive to Lincoln Park and stand on his doorstep and demand an explanation. I did not call my other children, my daughter Renee in Cincinnati, or my younger son Patrick in Portland, to tell them what their brother had done. I did not rage or grieve, or spend the night staring at the ceiling. I called Helen and told her to contact Hartwell's legal department. I called a private investigator named Raymond Cruz, who had done work for my firm years ago and who I trusted completely, and asked him to document Derek and Monica's movements and gather everything he could about their financial situation. And then I went to bed, and I slept. And in the morning I drove to the bakery 2 blocks from my house and had coffee and a piece of almond cake and watched the October light come through the window, and I thought about Carol standing at her kitchen window in that penthouse looking out at the lake. She would have been heartbroken. She would have cried for 3 days, and then she would have straightened up and said, "Take care of it, Walter." Raymond came back to me within 10 days with a picture I had suspected but not confirmed. Derek and Monica were in serious financial trouble. His firm had lost 3 major clients. They had taken out a second mortgage on the Lincoln Park house 2 years ago. Monica drove a car that was leased and 6 months behind on payments. They were not simply greedy. They were desperate. Desperate people make careless mistakes. Raymond also discovered that the notary, whose stamp appeared on the forged deed, a man named Frank Oduya, had a side business that Raymond described simply as document facilitation, which was the most professional way I had ever heard someone describe helping people commit fraud. Frank Oduya had been connected to 3 similar cases in Cook County in the past 4 years. Raymond had a photograph of Derek and Frank meeting at a coffee shop in Wicker Park on the same date the deed was notarized. I held that photograph for a long time. He was my son. I had stayed up with him when he had nightmares. I had driven 3 hours in a blizzard to pick him up when his car broke down sophomore year of college. I had paid the first 2 years of his law school tuition without being asked. I thought about Sophie, their daughter, who was 9 years old and had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and who had once told me that when she grew up, she wanted to build bridges like Grandpa. I set the photograph down on my desk and called Helen. "Let's proceed," I said. The following Tuesday, Derek called me for the second time in a month, which was already more than he'd called in the previous 6. His voice had changed. There was something underneath the surface of it, a current running the wrong direction. "Dad, I wanted to talk to you about the property transfer. I know we should have discussed it more." "Derek," I said, "did you transfer the penthouse into your name?" A pause. 3 seconds. 4. Long enough to tell me everything I needed to know about whether he was going to tell me the truth. "We filed some preliminary paperwork," he said carefully, "to explore the process. We were going to tell you." "With my signature," I said. Silence. "Derek, did you forge my signature on a legal document?" I could hear him breathing. I could hear the specific quality of that silence, the way it had weight to it, the way it pressed against the phone. I had heard that silence before, decades ago, when he was 12 years old and I asked him whether he had broken the window in the garage, and he stood there looking at me with exactly this same quality of stillness that meant he was calculating the cost of the truth against the cost of the lie. "Dad, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I said. "I look forward to hearing it." I hung up the phone. Hartwell Property Holdings retained their own attorneys, a firm called Garrison and Webb, who operated on a scale that made Derek's $400 an hour billing look like a lemonade stand. Because the fraud had been committed against the trust, Hartwell was not simply a bystander. They were a victim with standing. Garrison and Webb moved quickly. The quitclaim deed was challenged and suspended within 72 hours of Helen's filing. The county assessor's office froze all pending transfers on the property. Raymond Cruz's documentation went to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, along with Helen's brief and Hartwell's own independent investigation, which had turned up 2 additional documents that Derek and Monica had apparently been preparing: a letter of intent from a real estate broker for a sale price of $4.2 million, and an email chain between Monica and a financial advisor discussing moving funds offshore once the sale closed. They had been planning this for at least 8 months. I found that out on a Wednesday. I remember because I had been planning to drive to Evanston's Arboretum that afternoon, something Carol and I used to do in October when the maples turned, and instead, I sat in Helen's office on the 31st floor and read the email chain twice while Helen talked quietly on the phone in the corner. Monica had written to her financial advisor, "Once it's done, we won't have to worry about the old man anymore. He'll have the Evanston house and his pension. That's enough for someone his age. That's enough for someone his age." I folded the printout and put it in my jacket pocket and did not look at it again. 2 weeks later, on a bright Thursday in November, I drove downtown and parked in the garage beneath the building on Michigan Avenue. I took the elevator to the top floor. I stood at the window Carol had loved, with the lake spread out below in that particular deep November blue that looks like something out of a painting, and I stayed there for a long time without moving. Carl knocked at the door of the unit at noon to tell me the guests had arrived in the lobby. I had asked him to send them up. Derek and Monica came through the door together, which told me they had coordinated. Monica was carrying a bag from a bakery, which told me she thought this was still a conversation. Derek was in a suit, which told me he thought his profession was going to protect him from something. Behind them came Helen, and behind Helen came 2 representatives from Garrison and Webb, and behind them came 2 investigators from the state's attorney's office. Monica saw them and stopped walking. "Walter," she said. Her voice had lost the synthetic warmth. What was underneath it was much smaller and more afraid. "Sit down," I said. I had not moved from the window. Derek looked at the investigators. Something moved across his face that I recognized as the moment when a person understands that the calculation has already been completed and the answer is not what they hoped. He looked at me, and for a moment he looked exactly like he had at 12 years old standing in the garage with the baseball in his hand. "Dad, don't," I said. I said it the same way I had said it to Monica at the dinner table the night she tried to invoke Carol's name. Garrison and Webb's senior attorney, a tall woman named Patricia Walsh, laid 3 sets of documents on the dining room table. She walked Derek and Monica through each one, without a great deal of ceremony. The forged deed, the notary fraud, Raymond's photographs, the email chain, the letter of intent from the real estate broker, the trust documents, which established that the property had been held by Hartwell for 4 years and could not have been transferred regardless of any document Derek had filed. "The deed was legally void from the moment it was filed," Patricia said. "The property is not, and was never available for transfer without the institutional trustee's consent. By filing the deed, your client and his wife committed fraud against the county assessor's office, against the trust, and against Hartwell Property Holdings. The state's attorney's office is prepared to file charges." Monica had gone very pale. She was still holding the bakery bag. "Mr. Kowalski," one of the investigators said, looking at Derek, "I need to advise you that you have the right to have an attorney present." "I am an attorney," Derek said, which under other circumstances might have been almost funny. "Then you know," Patricia Walsh said simply. "They were not arrested in the penthouse." It happened later that afternoon, after Derek had made 3 phone calls to colleagues at his firm who were increasingly unavailable, and Monica had sat in the lobby of the building for 2 hours, apparently unable to decide where to go. The state's attorney's investigators were patient. The charges filed included forgery of legal documents, fraud against a financial institution, and conspiracy, which carried significant weight and would, Helen told me, result in Derek's likely disbarment, regardless of whatever sentence the court determined. I did not watch them leave. I was sitting at the window again with a cup of coffee when Helen came back upstairs to check on me. "It's done," she said. "Yes," I said. She sat down in the chair across from me, the one Carol used to use. She looked out at the lake the way Carol used to look at it. She said, "How are you doing, Walter?" I thought about that for a moment. How was I doing? My son had forged my signature to steal my dead wife's family property so that he and his wife could sell it for $4.2 million and move their money offshore. My son, who I had stayed up with during nightmares and driven 3 hours in a blizzard to rescue and put through 2 years of law school. My son, who used to make me cards about building bridges. "I've been better," I said. I called Renee that evening from the penthouse, which I had not done in years. She answered on the second ring, which is something Renee always does, as if she's been waiting for you specifically. I told her everything. She cried, which I had expected. And then she said something I had not expected, which was, "Dad, did you know? Did you suspect before any of this happened?" "I suspected the night he called me on a Tuesday," I said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I needed to be sure," I said. "And because the law needed to be the one to handle it. Not me." There was a long pause. Then Renee said, "Carol would have wanted you to fight for it." "I know," I said. "She's the one who told me to put it in the trust." That wasn't entirely true. It was something we had discussed. She had been the one who first said, years ago, long before she was sick, that the penthouse should be protected. That it was her father's legacy. And she was worried about what happened to things when people stopped being careful with them. I had been the one who finally made the call to Helen. But Carol had planted the seed. She usually did. I stayed at the penthouse for 4 nights. On the last morning, I stood at the window with my coffee the way she used to, looking out at the lake in the early light. There's a particular hour, just after sunrise, when the water looks like hammered silver, and the city is still quiet enough that you can hear something underneath all of it. Something that might be the building, settling, or might just be the ordinary sound of time passing over a place that has held a lot of living. I thought about the night Carol died, how I had come home to this place afterward and stood at this exact window and talked to her out loud in the empty apartment, because there was no one else to talk to, and the need to say her name to something was overwhelming. I had told her that I didn't know how to do any of it without her. The morning, the coffee, the decisions, the years. She would have known what to tell me about Derek. She always knew what to say about things that hurt. I didn't sell the penthouse. I want to be clear about that, because people always want to know what happened to the thing that was fought over, as if the property is the point. The property is not the point. I rented it for the first time in its history. To a family, a couple in their 30s with 2 kids, who filled the hallways with the kind of noise that reminded me that buildings are meant to be used. The income more than covered the building fees. Carl approved of them immediately, which was the only endorsement I required. I gave the first month's rent, in its entirety, to Sophie's college fund. She was 9 years old and had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she was going to need it, now that her parents' finances were about to become significantly more complicated. I set up the fund through Helen's office so it was protected and couldn't be touched until she was 18. I didn't tell Derek or Monica. I told Renee, and I told Patrick, and they both said it was the right thing to do. Sophie was not responsible for what her parents had chosen. She would be a different kind of structure when she grew up. I intended to make sure she had what she needed to build herself well. The trial took 14 months. I will not walk through every detail of it, because the legal mechanics of a fraud case are genuinely boring, and because the emotional reality of watching your son sit at a defendant's table in a courtroom is something I would not wish to revisit at length. Derek's law license was suspended pending the outcome, and later revoked. Monica pled guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for testimony. The notary Franco Duya was charged separately and cooperated fully once it became clear that cooperation was his best available option. Derek was sentenced in January, 22 months after that Tuesday morning phone call. I did not attend the sentencing. Helen attended on behalf of the trust. I was in Evanston, at the kitchen window, watching snow come down on the neighbor's yard, thinking about all the things I had built in my life, and which ones still stood. Bridges, mostly. 3 of them major. One across the Rock River that I am still genuinely proud of, that I drive across sometimes just to feel the road under the tires and know that I made that possible. The house in Evanston, which Carol and I had bought when Derek was 3, and which still had the height marks penciled on the kitchen door frame that I had never been able to bring myself to paint over. 38 years of marriage to a woman who looked at a view of Lake Michigan every morning and said, "How did we get so lucky? Some things hold, some things don't." The work of a life is figuring out which is which before they fall. My phone rang at 11:42 that morning. It was Patrick, calling from Portland in the middle of his workday. "Dad, he said. How are you? I'm all right, I said. And it was true, which surprised me a little. I've been thinking, Patrick said, about coming to visit. Maybe for Christmas. Bring the kids. If you're up for it. I'm up for it, I said. We could go downtown. Maybe that penthouse the new family is renting. Carl might let us use the lobby. Patrick, I said. Yeah? Just come home, I said. The house in Evanston is plenty. I hung up the phone and stood at the window a while longer. The snow had slowed to the particular kind of quiet that descends when a storm decides to rest, and the neighbor's yard was clean and white and still. And somewhere underneath all of it, the ground was doing exactly what it had always done, holding everything up,